Welcome, folks. We'll get started in a couple minutes.
Amy, I know that Anne's on her way.
Sounds good. Thanks, Erica.
In case you were worried.
Not that worried. We figure if she doesn't show up, I'll just have you give this talk in your sleep, which you probably could.
Oh, I think she's not in the right Zoom. She just said she's alone in the Zoom.
Oh no. Okay.
Yeah. So do you mind forwarding her, or I can forward her?
I'll go ahead and do that. Thanks.
Okay.
Erica.
Thank you.
I just sent it to her Gmail, Erica. That's a real funny trick to play on your guest speaker, is to send them the wrong Zoom information. For all of you wondering how to get better at being teachers, that's a real good one.
Let her know.
Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for being here.
She's coming. She's hopping on the right link now.
Right. Thanks. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes.
She hasn't gotten the email yet, Amy, so I'm gonna figure out how to send this to her just directly on
Okay.
text.
Okay.
So let me do that real quick.
I see her coming.
She's coming.
Here. Hey.
Hello.
Hey, Anne, I am so sorry for that uncool trick I played on you.
No worries. I was just by myself. I was like, well, I could just talk to myself.
I'm glad you're in the right place. I must have sent you the invite like ages ago, and then we have a new system for invites. So sorry about that.
No problem.
We're just waiting, just a couple more people are still joining, but and then I'll have a couple of announcements and then I'll introduce the two of you. As we get started, thank you. Emily has started us off in the chat with a question about learning objectives. So thanks, Emily. And then I see Gabor introduced himself in the chat, which is so awesome. I wonder if folks wouldn't mind just following Gabor's lead and just introducing yourself in the chat, and maybe if you're able to just a word or two about where you practice and who you teach, who are your students where you're working, and that way we can just kind of all learn from each other, and Anne can get a sense of who she's teaching today. So as we do that and as those roll in, I'm going to share my screen just briefly, just for a couple of announcements. So welcome you all. I think this is the fourth. Am I counting that right, Naomi? I think this is our fourth meeting of the Network of Pediatric Palliative Care Educators. A huge gratitude to all of you who've been coming to our meetings and learning with us and offering your expertise in this area. Our one big announcement today is that our next meeting, which is September 20th, 2 months from now, we are doing kind of a different style of meeting. We're doing a rapid fire educational exchange. So we wanted to get a chance for folks who are in this community to sort of start to present some of their work and get some feedback on their work, and do some more kind of small group work just to do more networking, getting to know each other. So the way our next meeting will be run is we'll have 20 minutes in a large group like this, where 4 people will present just kind of a 5-minute teaser about their educational intervention or initiative or curriculum. And then everybody that's in the meeting will get to choose one of those topics to learn more about, and we'll go into breakout rooms based on the topic. So the reason I'm talking about this now is that we have, I think, at least 2 folks already signed up to lead a topic, but we're looking for 2 more of you. So if any of you guys are doing something cool at your home institutions and you want to get some feedback on it or present it in a informal, hopefully not too scary of a way, just shoot me an email, and we're excited. We'd be excited to have you guys present. So, and if you have any questions about that, you can pop them in the chat. I'll monitor the chat after this. So today's topic is anti-racism in palliative care education. And we're trying to start kind of a new practice at NPPCE where we choose some of our advisory board members to actually moderate these topics, these discussions. And so today's discussion will be moderated by my dear friend, Eric Patnode, who is a licensed clinical social worker and a mental health specialist. She is the director of bioethics and palliative care at Seattle Children's Hospital, and also a clinical instructor at the University of Washington School of Social Work, rather. Arka is also the founder of More Genesis Consulting, which is a consulting firm that consults on engagement and culturally responsive practices for institutions. She's faculty for CAPC, she's on the board for SWIPN, she's a general badass and a real expert in this area. And so Arka is going to moderate this talk by Anne Keleman, and she'll introduce her. And so I'm going to turn it over to Monica.
Thank you, Amy. That was such a lovely introduction. Before I introduce my dear friend and colleague, Anne Keleman, I have one request for all of us. And my request is, as we listen to Anne and we participate in this very important hour today, that we suspend our kind of cerebral selves, our academic selves, and that we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Talking about anti-oppression work, anti-racism work can be very uncomfortable, depending on your positionality in the world. And so I'm asking for all of us to get comfortable with being uncomfortable over this next hour. So with that said, I would like to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Anne Keleman, who is the Director of Psychosocial and Spiritual Care for the section of palliative care at MedStar Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C. And there Anne conducts patient care, teaches, and participates in a variety of research activities. In addition to her direct practice work, Anne is an assistant professor of medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center and also teaches for the Smith College School of Social Work End of Life Certificate Program, and she is the current chair of the Social Work Hospice and Palliative Care Network. And if you all can join me in a virtual welcome to Anne. Anne, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully you can hear me okay and you can see slides. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about anti-racism in hospice and palliative care. So my first slide is, why is a white lady talking about racism? So I usually cope with humor. And I will say, to call myself in, not only like a white lady, but a very white lady. I have this very blonde hair and blue eyes. I grew up in a small farming town outside of Buffalo, New York, which is one of the most racially segregated cities that has been recently highlighted by the shootings that happened there. And I'm not trained in anti-racist practice. I don't have a background in critical race theory, but I went to social work school and landed in Baltimore City, which was a predominantly Black city. And now I work in Washington, D.C. in a predominantly Black hospital. And so a lot of this talk comes out of my experience as being a witness daily to racism that happens within the medical community. And ways that, we can continue to speak up against when we are seeing racism, and how we can work to change culture within our own systems. I recently read Ruth King's Mindful of Race. She takes a Buddhist perspective. And so I have a couple of quotes of hers throughout the talk. And I love this quote. It would be wholesome for all of humanity if white people as a collective were to see themselves as racial individuals, to recognize whiteness as a racial constellation with roots, history, power, and privilege that negatively impact other races, and then organize themselves to dismantle racial constellations of harm. And to continue with Ruth King, so to understand white privilege understands white group identity. And this would involve white individuals claiming themselves as a race and engaging each other in their history, power, and impact on each other and other races. And this is not done. And so throughout the book, she talks a lot about how this isn't done. And her suggestions include, so what can white people do? You can own whiteness, you can talk to your children about whiteness, dismantle structural racism, lead cultural change initiatives within organizations, and organize racial human rights movements. So I know that sounds like a lot. We only have an hour, so I'm going to choose two to talk about. I think an important one is owning whiteness, because rather than looking outward, how can we turn inward? And then leading culture change initiatives within the organizations and the institutions with which we work, and most importantly, where we're teaching other people. So what I often think of this as, what white people actually do. When you sort of are engaging in whiteness, it's often heard of, but I'm a good person and I worked really hard to get where I am. I'm from a liberal town. I myself have, Black Lives Matter t-shirts or lawn signs. And this is a lot of what Ruth King talks about in her book is, how do we go beyond that? How do we go beyond these symbols and these checklists, and how so much of this is not about checklists? So I want to talk for a moment about white saviorism. And if you haven't read this article, it's really good. But, I think of whites, and this article makes the point about white saviors are more interested in their own emotional validation than helping others. It's kind of this concept of rescuing. And I see that happens a lot within medical institutions and hospitals, like how people want to swoop in to make a difference. And what I really like is Rachel Remen talks about this and the concept of helping versus fixing versus serving. And she talks about when you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. And when we serve, you see life as whole. And she talks in this article about fixing and helping is the work of the ego and service being the work of the soul. And when you're talking about service, it's an equal relationship versus sort of this helping. And even talking about, social work being a helping profession. And we certainly, within our own social work profession, haven't really begun to explore the roots of oppression within our own discipline. And often are talking about helping versus the concept of serving. And I really like the concept of serving. So the Seeing White podcast is probably about 12 or so episodes that really examines whiteness. And this quote, again, that white people must own and take responsibility for the advantages that come with whiteness. This is a lot that they talk about throughout this podcast. And so how do I recognize my privilege? I think a lot of this starts internally. And when I was doing this talk, I was noticing a lot of what was coming up for me. Like, it didn't feel good. It felt like very uncomfortable to sit down and be like, how do I recognize my privilege? So one example is, I'm a blonde woman. If I go missing, I know that I'll be found. I know not only that I will be found, but I know that my story will be all over the news. And when I was working in Baltimore years ago, I used to drive through a predominantly Black neighborhood. It was the quickest way, for me to kind of get to work. And I'd sit at this stop sign every day and I would see this picture of this Black girl who was missing. She was probably about 8 or 9. And over the months that I was working my internship there, like, her picture started fading. And I just remember having a conversation with my clinical supervisor, how come her picture, like, I don't see anything on the news. I don't see anything on the news about this young missing girl. But if that was a young, missing white girl, this would be all over the news. And then I often think of privilege in the clothing that I'm allowed to wear, or the tattoos that I might have. And I have a young son, and so he was running outside the one day, and I was putting his hoodie on him, and I was like, "It's cold, you need a sweatshirt." And he was just going out in our front yard, and he put up his hood and he turned around and looked at me. And in that moment, I had this realization of my privilege, as and it was a moment that I kind of stopped and thought, well, this is a privilege that I have that a Black mother doesn't have, where he can go out in my neighborhood. When he's older, I don't have to worry about him in the stereo, when he gets pulled over by police, what might happen to him. So those are some ways that I recognize my privilege. I don't know if people want to put in the chat. I think this is a way to engage on how we can turn more inward in the work that we're doing. And really, I think we talk a lot about racism. Within my institution, we do have a lot of talks around DEI work, but what we have less conversations about is talking about whiteness. I wonder if that resonates with you, Arika. Within your institutions, you have a lot of talk about DEI, but not really talk about putting all the references in the chat. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I am. And it's interesting, Anne, I I absolutely agree with you. And I think about how DEI work has really gotten corporatized, right? Like it's really become checkboxy. And I see that within my organization, and my organization is making a great attempt at becoming an anti-racist organization, but there still is that checkboxiness of it, right? And so when we collectively are focused on the corporatization, or, we miss the pieces that you're talking about here.
Yeah, yeah. And again, like it feels in like even doing this, or even like engaging in that, feels uncomfortable. And it's so how can we get comfortable with being, as you say, with being uncomfortable? There'll be a slide on that later too. So to go back to the Seeing White podcast, in the Seeing White podcast, almost on every episode, he has a guest who teaches at Rutgers, Chenjerai Kumanyaka. And I just love this quote in one episode. He says, well, when was whiteness good? Because the idea is engaging in your privilege and in whiteness, it's not good for anybody. And then he goes on to say, it's kind of like, when was America great? And I just think those are two great quotes out of this Seeing White podcast on how really we need to like remake our system over. And it's not a top 10 list. Unfortunately, this was in the Journal of Palliative Medicine just this last year. Top 10 tips of palliative care clinicians about delivering anti-racist care. And I was grateful that there was a response by Dr. Kersen and Dr. Bullock. And in their response, they really highlight, I'm going to read it here because it's, I think, right on this first page where it says, the implicit assumption in these tips is that white researchers and clinicians will have a magic wand that, when waved, Black patients and families will simply accept what is offered to them culturally congruent care. And, this premise is really just based on a dominant ideology. So I'd really encourage everyone to read this response because it really highlights what's troublesome about this top 10 list. So Arika put this in the chat, white supremacy culture. I think this is a way that when you're talking about teaching, you can engage each of these, and there's more, but I highlighted these because these are common that I often see coming up. Rachel Berman has a great quote about perfectionism, about how perfectionism makes other people feel small. And so when in the white supremacy characteristics, when you're talking about perfectionism, there's little appreciation expressed among people for the work that others are doing. And it's more common to point out how the other person is inadequate, or talk about how the other person is inadequate, rather than just going directly to that person to have a conversation with them. And how can we improve in that is really to just develop appreciation for each other, and really reflecting on how mistakes offer an opportunity for learning. I think within the medical culture and with working in a hospital system, there's so much about the culture where if you think about rounding daily, where I spend a lot of time in the intensive care unit, and so much pressure is put on people to get the right answer, and not inviting in, well, that was a great thought, but I wonder, that was a great thought, and I wonder what you're, worried about this lab work or something, as a way to engage rather than always having to have that right answer. And sense of urgency, continued sense of urgency that makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive. I think of this often in how we just pressure families to make decisions on medical care. And we're doing this so much, where if we can just leave space, and engage leadership and understanding that things take longer than are expected. And a great supervisor of mine once told me, don't let anyone's sense of urgency become your sense of urgency. And that has really always stuck with me, because I'm often saying, maybe we can give this family 24 hours, there, there's not, or even if you're saying within teaching or within a family meeting, there's no decision that needs to be made today. You can see people just take a breath and then be able to engage more, and that helps build trust and rapport. Defensiveness is really hard. People respond to newer challenging ideas with defensiveness. It makes it very difficult to raise ideas. And I love the point she makes about defensiveness with white people. Like, white people spend energy defending against charges of racism instead of examining how racism is actually happening. And I would love if there's a way, I know there's a way to teach this, and I would love within a hospital culture, if we can say, as we're rounding, well, where is the racism in this case? Or where is the whiteness coming up? Because it's throughout everything. And we often say, if a family, I was in a patient's room, I was working this weekend, and his wife was very upset. And she said to me, I've told many people this, if he was a white man, he would be getting different care. If he was a white man with money, he would be getting different care. And oftentimes the response from administration, or the response from a lot of people that go in that room, would be like, oh no, we treat everybody the same. But that's sort of taking that comment personally without really broadening that view and broadening that lens of, we know that there's structural racism. We know that there's structural racism, that he has been treated different before we've landed in that room. And how can we work to change that and make this experience different? And then finally, that there's only one right way, the belief that there's one right way to do things. This makes me think of the concept, which I think came out of Zen hospice, cultivating your don't know mind. So instead of there being only one right way, trying to cultivate your don't know mind, that while I may have treated and seen a lot of families whose mother is dying from breast cancer, this is a new family. And so there's not only one, right way. So I just want to check in, and this is Lovey J. Jones, who has a great TED Talk on getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. So I just wanted to maybe take a minute to check in there to see if there's any thoughts in the chat before we move forward.
And I'm going to just read a couple of responses about privilege that folks have put in the chat. So Amy says, my experience with privilege, when I experience pain, I will be believed.
Mm-hmm.
And Naomi says, my experience with privilege, crossing the border between Canada and the US with basically no questions.
Mm-hmm.
And then Naomi goes on to say, still on the previous comment about privilege, right after the Muslim family was killed in London, Ontario last summer, reckless driver who drove into them on purpose because they were Muslim. I heard another physician mom reflect that this is her concern daily for her family. They are Muslim as well, that they cannot even cross the street safely. I do not even consider my clothing or my children's clothing when crossing the street, and I am privileged because of that. Noam says, my experience with privilege. I grew up as an Orthodox Jew and could feel myself as a minority and looked at different based on what I wear. When I chose to no longer wear identifying clothing, I felt that I was looked at differently. I have the privilege of choosing if I want to be a representative of a minority group or anonymous. And Gina shares, so I had also put in the chat for folks to share instances in which they have experienced or seen what you were just talking about in their experience or in their practice. And Gina shares labeling a family angry when they just disagree. Amy put in the chat, the defensiveness Anne describes when families are brave enough to bring up their feelings of discrimination is so common, and we are so quick to try to explain this away, and it exacerbates the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll get to that angry family. I have other examples about that, and we'll have a chance to talk. Thank you all. Those are great.
Keep putting examples in the chat.
Yeah. So now we'll move on. So that's a little bit about kind of identifying our privilege, owning, whiteness, talking about whiteness, and how can we lead culture change within organizations? So I think in our daily patient staff interactions, policy changes, documentation is huge. And then I also think, rounding. So we'll start off with this patient, and I have a couple of patient narrative examples here that we'll go through. And so this is a 22-year-old who's admitted after an overdose and admitted to the ICU and further complications needing to be placed on ECMO. And during admission, she was found to be pregnant. And our palliative care team, we get consulted now on anybody who is on ECMO. And the nurse, doesn't, so kind of rounding that day, we sort of talked about the plan of supporting her who's alert, and then also maybe reaching out to the family to see how they're doing. And the nurse doesn't want, her boyfriend to visit. So I'm wondering if you're either even teaching, about this, or if this was somebody you were caring for. What do you think might happen next, or what do you think is going on here? Or what might you do if you encounter the nurse and she says, I don't really, her boyfriend's supposed to come later, I don't want him to visit. You can put things in the chat or.
My first question would be, can you tell me a little bit more about why you don't want him to visit?
Yeah, so great. So I was like, well, I'm wondering what you're worried about or what. And she said, well, I don't want him to get her all riled up, like happened. The nurse told me that happened a few days ago. And I said, okay. And I said, well, he wasn't there yet. And I said, well, I was noticing first my own internal reaction, where I was noticing like a little tightness in my chest. So it's also important to be aware of what's going on in our own nervous system. And I said, well, I'm wondering if you could just page me. Why don't you page me when he comes? So she didn't page me. She was doing something else when he came. And I came back later and at the end of the day, and she said, and I said, how did it go? Did he show up? And she said, well, exactly what I said happened. And I said, okay, well, tell me more. And she said, well, she got so agitated when he came. And that's sort of a word for me, like agitated, just like somebody put in the chat, angry, that I want to know more about. And I have found that sometimes we try to answer things intellectually. When somebody's having like an emotional reaction, we try to answer it intellectually, or maybe with medication when somebody's talking about agitation. And I said, well, can you tell me what agitation looked like in her body? And she said, well, she just started like, she was scribbling really fast. And I said, okay, well, did you have a chance to like talk with them about what she was saying? And she said, well, she was just saying, please don't leave me. I love you. But then her heart rate was going up. And I said, well, it's been a long time since I've been in my 20s, but I said, I can imagine that if you have an experience like this, you would be terrified that the person that you care about most might, leave you. And she kind of relaxed her shoulders a bit, and we had a conversation around that. I later went and talked to the patient, but I could see that was, I've been in this situation many times, that I could see that was sort of, I really wanted to like adjust the narrative there, because what do you think would have maybe happened in a few days if this nurse signed out, she gets agitated when her boyfriend comes. There's an overdose, she gets agitated. I'm curious, Arika, what I can see you shaking your head, or Amy, what do you think would happen next?
Amy, do you want to respond? Or you're shaking your head?
Oh, you're just reminding me of all the ways in which our sort of handoffs it's like the ultimate game of telephone and medicine. Yep. And that maybe the next nurse just hears the word agitated and then fills in some narrative that then gets handed off to the next nurse. She gets agitated because they had a fight the day before she got admitted, or because, and it sort of gets filled in this kind of unsafe way.
Or even worse, right? That the boyfriend is her abuser, or right, like all of these stories can get created when we don't explore further.
Yeah, or the children, they had another child. The child isn't safe with him, or or he shouldn't be allowed to visit, or like then he would be labeled as angry. So, that's one of example of how can we work to change this narrative, or how can we stop it before it starts? Sometimes it's intervening.
And
So-
Kathy, sorry,
Oh, go
and
ahead.
Kathy put a couple of comments just in the chart. Amanda says same thing happens in notes, labels, carry forward, and documentation. And Kathy, thank you for naming that it's also through physicians, social workers, chaplain report, not just nursing.
Yes, it is. I don't want to call in, it's through everybody. And we'll get to documentation later. That is great, because there's a lot of. Okay, so this is sort of the angry son. I often think you can take this angry label and apply it, to any family member. So this was a woman who was 78, and she was admitted after a stroke, and she initially improved and then had a second stroke and was transferred to the ICU. And visitation was limited during this time, secondary to COVID. And so the ICU team, our palliative team wasn't involved until she had that second ICU transfer. And so the ICU team, and this is kind of throughout documentation, throughout multiple conversations with various members, so nursing, social work, residents, the ICU describes son as angry. He calls too much. He was demanding to speak with mom last night. He's coming in today, so we asked security to be present. And this is all too, familiar to me as well. And I often think that it's interesting, sort of, it kind of goes back to like, there's only one right way. Well, how much do we expect him to be calling? Like, he calls too much, or sometimes it's the family's always here or the family's never here. Like all or nothing thinking that we engage in, or words that may seem subtle, but demanding to speak with mom. It's his mother. And, he's coming in today, so we asked security to be present. And so my question sort of to that, even though sometimes I'll ask a question that I know the answer to, but even as a way to sort of just slow things down, because the son was coming in and they said he'll be here in like an hour. I said, well, I wonder, is this standard policy to ask security to be present for this meeting? Or can you help me understand why we might be asking security to be present? And the documentation stuff too, right? So we often then will document these things in the chart, and that's a permanent record. So he really wanted his mother transferred. And so then if she gets transferred to another institution, these notes will travel with her, and the notes about labeling the son will travel. So I'm curious if this is a familiar, I know, Arik, I see you shaking your head. If this happens, I know this happens in pediatrics where there's more calls on the Black father. Yeah.
And there's some comments in the chat, and so Alani says in Pete's hospital, it happens often, the quote unquote angry father instead of the angry son. Mm-hmm. Emily, thanks for putting your essay about this. So Emily says how adult medicine hates the family advocate. I wrote an essay about it recently and put the link in the chat as well.
Oh, that's great. I would love to read that. Yeah. Okay, for the interest of time, I'll go on. So then we have the difficult family. We often are framing, so this is a patient who had been in the hospital for a very long time. The daughter's response to team, was recommending home hospice after her mother's been in the hospital for 45 days. So sometimes we don't come in also till the very end. And it's kind of that idea of coming into, my colleague and friend Terry Attilio frames that as coming in like in the third act of a play or something, where we don't really know what happened in those 45 days. But so, kind of the daughter's response in this was, I just need a week. And that, in my mind seems reasonable, but within a medical, and within a hospital, again, it goes back to just allowing people time. And that was sort of immediately met with labeling this daughter as difficult, and framed around, well, if you need a week to make a decision, then we'll have to get a guardian for your mom. To which the daughter responded with a very long letter that was sent to our hospital president. And then this is sort of another way we're engaging in sort of the daughter's narrative around, like, why are you labeling me as difficult? My mom's life matters. But then that wasn't met with engaging in a conversation face to face with the daughter. It was met more with, this idea we always have too that comes up, she's claiming racism. And that's how sort of administration meets that. And so it seems overwhelming to kind of change that whole system, but how can we change that within our own teams or when we're teaching? And so I try to be mindful of when somebody says this family's difficult, help me. It sounds like she's grieving. Her mom's been in the hospital for 45 days. It sounds like there was an interaction when we were going to try to discharge her that was troubling for her. And also trying to intervene and find out who is able to build a relationship. So we kind of have on that side, difficult family and then a lovely family. This was in the Journal of Palliative Medicine. And I really like the reflections in here. And it talks about what, leaving kind of a meeting where a family meeting where a comment was, oh, what a lovely family. And sort of the thought was, or was it that this white English speaking cisgendered heterosexual family is my cognitive shortcut for what a lovely family looks like, even though my own family doesn't look like that. And then the article goes on to talk about sort of what we were just talking about here, stereotypes of Black moms, aggressive, difficult to engage, not warm, non-compliant. And we'll go into a little bit of these when I get into documentation, because I see a lot of these words that come up in documentation. So this is a great TED Talk on the danger of a single story. So Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she also has a lovely book on notes on grief, which is really wonderful after the death of her. I don't know if anyone's read it, after the death of her father. But the danger of the single story really talks about these stereotypes that we engage in, and that it's not that, and really sort of reflecting on, are you getting caught here in the danger of the single story? And this is like a great teaching point. So like you have just this angry mom, and then you're running with that narrative that she's an angry mother. But what is the other story? And I often see the single story being applied throughout narratives. Okay, so then that's a little bit about how we engage in patient and staff interactions, but then policy change within hospitals, which often seems overwhelming. And so one way that within our institution, we attempted to engage in some changing policies is there is this sign that I had noticed that often gets labeled on patients' rooms. This is just what our institution does. And I think other institutions do similar things when when a patient is upset, and this sign is assigned to nursing or just hospital staff that they may be aggressive. And we kind of spent a long time trying to dig up where the data is in this. And sort of the short story here is, after many, many months of asking for the data and finding the data and looking at the data, our hospital system was predominantly placing these signs and calling what our system, it's called a code BERT, which is like a behavioral emergency response. I know ARCA Children's Hospital, yours was code purple, right? And we were predominantly calling them more on Black men, largely. So we're right now in the middle of how are we going to change this? So we finally got the data, because the data often can tell a story, right? And so a lot of this is just witnessing kind of what happens, and then how can we bring up within hospital committees. Oftentimes it's getting on a hospital committee, because within hospital systems, changes happen within those committees. So that's a way of challenging policy. Another is the visitation policy. So during COVID, we had, no visitors, but for end of life, we were allowing 2 people at the bedside, but they had to be first degree relatives. And so we really worked with ethics. Our palliative care teams worked with ethics to challenge this policy, because again, it goes back to that white supremacy characteristic of there's only one right way. There's only one family. So, if it was a grandmother who was dying, who raised her grandson, he was not allowed to visit because he wasn't a first degree relative. So it was only, children or parents that could visit. And so that was one way of challenging kind of a policy that was really rooted in white supremacy. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, I'll go a little faster so we can have a couple minutes for discussion, but documentation is, you could probably have a whole hour talk on documentation. This article by Godou talks about the medical record being a mechanism for transmitting bias and something that hasn't been researched. I've noticed in the last couple of years, there's been more articles looking at this, and I think it largely has to do with the open notes. So now that patients are going to be able to read their notes, and this is just from a chart that I pulled, and I think even the word like refusing, we may not see as judgmental, but if you read this, like patient refusing assessment in vital signs, most medication, including heparin, but wanting pain meds. And this was just within one day, refusing assessment, but wanted pain meds. And you know, that word, you know, refused, was there any sort of exploring what was going on? Was the pain medication not working? Did he need an increase in dose? And there's a lot of dynamics that evolve over long hospital stays. So for somebody that is in the hospital for 120 days, and then there can be so much labeling that happens in a chart. So why does stigmatizing language matter? In this study by Godou, what they did was they gave a sample note to medical students who read the note, one with stigmatizing language, one with more neutral language. And so the exposure to the stigmatizing language note was associated with more negative attitudes towards the patient. And reading the stigmatizing language was associated with less aggressive pain management. And these are all on the references. And then this article, which is recent from 2022, what was surprising to me here was that this was history and physical notes. So often in documentation, I'm seeing more bias in the subjective. So they just looked at H&P notes, and Black patients had 2.54 times the odds of having at least one negative descriptor in the H&P. And then the commonly used descriptors were refused, non-compliant, or agitated. So this is just recent, was published a few months ago, My Daughter's Keeper. And I just love this reflection that comes with beautiful examples of how we can improve our documentation. So within there, Dr. Simon notes, so plan, acknowledge that the medical system has historically undertreated Black patients' pain, address the inappropriateness of language in her record, example, difficult patient, that is often used to describe marginalized groups. And, you know, something else you can include in your documentation, he is attempting to advocate in a health care system that is unkind to people with a past substance use. I love these examples, and I'm just wondering if there's anybody who's ever seen this document. And I think those are beautiful ways that we can enhance our documentation and our teaching. Maybe I'll pause there to see if there's any thoughts around documentation in the chat, because this is a big one.
And I had asked a question earlier for folks just to kind of reflect on when they hear certain words like difficult, like agitated, who comes to mind, right? Like, who do you envision in your head? And that is one of the ways that implicit biases or implicit white supremacy can show up, because I'll be honest with you, as a Black woman, sometimes when I hear some of those labels, I even think about, like, was it a Black dad? Was it a Black, you know, and that's the way that white supremacy, the threat of white supremacy is just, it's just present. We're acculturated in it.
Yeah, and it doesn't, I think that what happens is, you know, it doesn't make you yourself like a terrible person to have those thoughts, right? These are the thoughts that this is the culture that we've been swimming in. And so there's gotta be, you know, and then I think the growth is recognizing that thought, like you're gonna have that thought, recognizing that thought, and then figuring out how you can recognize it and you know, and change that culture. Okay. So then kind of the last thing is team rounds, calling in versus inviting in. So we talk a lot about this on our palliative care team, and I've seen it before where, you know, just on rounds where somebody might be talking about a patient they saw yesterday. And, or we might be, you know, we might have a resident who's with us and we're talking about a patient and somebody starts to kind of, you know, talk about this narrative of, oh, the patient has a drug history, labels that might come up, angry or aggressive, and ways we can just pause and say, okay, I wonder what else is going on. I wonder, like, it sounds like he might be worried, or it sounds like he might be scared. And being able, you know, Ruth King talks about this in her book too, that nobody, regardless of how much you've done a lot of internal work, likes being called out, especially in front of a group. But how can you create a culture on rounds where there might be a way to say, hey, can we just take a time out? Like, somebody just said, you know, that patient is difficult, or that patient is a drug user. I just want to like take a minute. And, you know, I just sort of felt that, like, I felt that kind of in my gut. And I wonder if we could just take a minute to reflect on how we might be able to talk about and figure out what's going on and how we can best help her. Those are some ways. Sometimes it's having a lot of conversations within your team, because that's not easy. It can be hard. And then a lot of those white supremacy characteristics come up, you know, defensiveness is a big one that comes up, and the calling in versus calling out or inviting in.
And I put an example in the chart of this comes up often in NICU, in our NICU, when a parent who has given birth is maybe on methadone and has been on methadone for quite a while as treatment for substance abuse. And just even the way that the language is used, like, well, this mom, she had a positive tox screen for methadone, right? Without naming what the rest of the story is. So a couple of other thoughts in the chat. Gina says, not only words like difficult, angry, non-compliant, but also when providers write descriptors like lovely, kind, and cute.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Cute and sweet I see that a lot with older adults.
Yeah. And then Ilana put in the labeling and use of difficult or angry language is also being used to label our colleagues outside of palliative care. Important to invite in about care and collegiality as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, yes, that's a great point.
Yeah.
And if there's something upsetting, like sort of that goes back to the perfectionism where you're not kind of going right to the person to say, this happens a lot here, like, and I'm guilty of this too, when I do a meeting in the SICU and it's a surgeon who's, you know, there's also systems of power here. And I'm a social worker where may say something that's upsetting, and then we kind of talk about it after, rather than somebody having a direct conversation with that surgeon of, you know, I'm wondering, like, what you said to that family was upsetting to me. Could we have a minute and talk about that?
And Naomi says that I have often struggled with that, how to reflect as a group on our use of language without calling anyone out. What I have often witnessed is our judgment about patient or family reactions to new, i.e. family appropriately devastated. How can we just comment on emotions without these descriptors and encourage colleagues and ourselves? And then
I've read news, but
yeah.
I love that on us.
Yes, news. Yes, thank you. And then Amy responded to Ilana by saying, this is a very good point to add to this. I think palliative care has an important role in interrupting biases in descriptions used both by our own team members and others in the hospital. The latter is more challenging in a place we all can grow into.
Yeah. I think of it for the physicians who are in the group, and I don't know how it works for like NP students, but our social work fellow, we co-sign all of their notes. And so that's a great teaching. And I know for physicians, if you're a resident, or we have residents that rotate our fellows, their notes are always co-signed. And I know a lot of this comes down to being busy at the end of the day, and some things might get missed, but if there's a way to really have great learning when you're signing those notes of, And some of it is copy and pasting, right? We all do that because we're busy. So sometimes you might copy and paste in HPI and not realize in that first line, it says, you know, I don't know, 25-year-old homeless male or something. That's a descriptor I see often in an H&P line rather than in a social history. So I have a quote here as we wrap up, as we were talking about sort of just swimming in this, going back to Ruth King. Privilege is the water that dominance swims in. It's impossible to understand it when we look solely from the lens of an individual. And then also just to end with a quote by James Baldwin, you know, a country is only as strong as the people who make it up, and the country turns into what people want it to become. And so we made this world we're living in, and we need to make it over. I don't know if there's any questions so I'm going to stop sharing. And can you hear me okay? One of the things I did this past year for our fellows at the end of the year, because I'm a visual learner, and sometimes after a Zoom talk, I'm sort of, and that was a lot of information I went over, I'm kind of tired. And so I started doing what I call a mashup poem, which is just basically like taking everything that was like in this learning, and I mix up sort of the quotes and put it into a form of a poem. So if everyone's okay with that, it probably will take a minute or two, and I'm just going to read this mashup poem that I did. Okay. Because sometimes when we hear things in poetry, it just enters in a different way, maybe not here, but here. So, all right. Angry, aggressive, agitated. We call the black sun that tries to advocate for his dying mother. His dreadlocks and neck tattoos scare us into calling security. Policy prevents the black grandson from seeing his dying grandmother because administration believes there is only one right way, one right family. Our permanent documentation transmits bias. Refusing, non-compliant, labels that harm, continue to marginalize those that have long been historically marginalized. Dry up your white tears and advocate for policy change and systems change. Perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, only one right way, they need to fade away. It's time to dismantle these white supremacy characteristics. White people, see yourselves as racial individuals, recognize whiteness, its deep roots of harm, teach about whiteness, dismantle whiteness. Move away from checklists and symbols in your yard. Allyship goes beyond checklists. Look inward, recognize your privilege. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Privilege is the water that dominance swims in. So broaden the lens from your individual view. White people made this system of power and oppression, and we must work to make it over. Thank you.
And that was a phenomenal talk, and that mashup was just, it was amazing. And thank you for sharing. You know, as I'm sitting here thinking about this, what keeps coming up for me is that you just showed such an example of what allyship can and should look like, right? And it's not just allyship to individuals, but allyship within systems and beyond, and, you know, from the micro, meso, macro level. So, Anne, thank you so much for being an incredible ally to me and to others. And I hope that this session was beneficial and gave everybody things to reflect upon.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a very fast hour, so.
Thanks so much, Anne and Erica. We'll see you all in September. If folks have additional questions or thoughts, I'm volunteering Anne and Erica to stay on for a few extra minutes.
Yeah, I can stay on for a few minutes.
I can too.
And I sent the slides, so you can have a copy of the slides.
And I think we need to do this like with CAPSI, with one of their,
That's a good idea.
yeah, one of their virtual